Hey guys, tonight we begin with you, an unsuspecting time traveller foolish enough to land in the mud-soaked madness of medieval Europe. Yeah, from castles that leak to peasants that don't. It's a world where chivalry dies faster than hygiene. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. If you're time travelling to medieval Europe, your biggest danger isn't the plague or a sword. It's your shampoo. The moment you show up smelling like coconut or mountain breeze, congratulations, you've just announced to everyone within sniffing distance that you are either possessed, royal, or about to be burned alive for sorcery. You see, in the Middle Ages, smelling bad wasn't shameful. It was normal. The average peasant's scent could peel paint. Most people hadn't seen a bathtub, and the ones who did thought water carried disease. Which, to be fair, it did. But so did everything else. Bathing was viewed as suspiciously sensual. The church decided that sharing bathwater might lead to impure thoughts, which is funny considering no one could even see through the steam and filth. Public bathhouses were eventually shut down for being dens of sin, as if anyone could feel romantic surrounded by 30 naked strangers and an overwhelming aroma of wet cabbage. If you pop out of your time machine freshly showered, locals won't see hygiene. They'll see sorcery. They'll assume you've been blessed or cursed by forces unknown. How do you smell like flowers when you live in a swamp? They'll ask, right before calling the nearest priest to examine you with holy water that smells like old soup. So your first survival step, get filthy immediately. Roll in mud, hug a pig, sleep in hay, whatever it takes. The goal is to achieve that authentic medieval aroma, equal parts smoke, sweat, and mild regret. You want to smell like someone who hasn't seen hope in 3 harvests. And don't think the nobles were any better. They just covered the rot with perfume, gallons of it. Imagine roses, musk, and body odour having a knife fight. That's what a medieval banquet smelled like. Their teeth were rotting, their clothes unwashed, and yet they were convinced the real sinners were the ones who bathed twice a month. So remember, in medieval Europe, your modern cleanliness is a death sentence. You don't want to smell good. You want to smell period accurate. If someone wrinkles their nose at you, relax. That's not disgust. That's acceptance. You finally blended in. If you're planning to drink water in medieval Europe, don't. That's not hydration. That's suicide by bacteria. Back then, water wasn't clear. It was a challenge. Every sip was like spinning the plague wheel and hoping it didn't land on explosive dysentery. The average river was a medieval smoothie, a nutritious blend of mud, dead fish, and whatever the guy upstream was dumping into it. And by whatever, I mean human waste, animal waste, and occasionally actual humans. So yes, people drank beer. Not for the taste, not for fun, but because it was the only thing keeping civilization from dehydrating to death. Ale wasn't strong, maybe 2 or 3% alcohol, just enough to kill germs and your ambitions for the day. It was called small beer, and everyone drank it. Men, women, even toddlers. Picture a 3-year-old stumbling around with a wooden mug, slurring something about grain taxes. That was childhood. Morning, beer. Lunch, beer. Church, light beer, out of respect. Water was so distrusted that if you refused ale, people assumed you were either insane or plotting something. In fact, refusing a drink was borderline heresy. The tavern was the social heart of every village, a place where deals were made, songs were sung, and someone inevitably got stabbed over spilled mead. And before you imagine cosy pubs with polished mugs and cheerful laughter, no. Medieval taverns were sticky, smoky rooms full of shouting men, suspicious soup, and the overwhelming smell of regret. The house ale was usually brewed by someone who measured ingredients using intuition and desperation. If it didn't make you sick, you tipped them extra. Travellers had it even worse. The further you went, the riskier the brew. By the time you reached a new village, you'd be lucky to get something that hadn't fermented into bread That's why most time travelers in theory would never make it home. Not because of paradoxes, but because of intestinal collapse by day 3. So take my advice. If you find yourself in the 14th century, forget your fancy micro-filtered water bottle. Order the ale, say a prayer, and don't ask what's floating in it. In medieval Europe, beer wasn't a beverage, it was life support. If you take one piece of advice from this entire time travel guide, let it be this. Don't argue with the church. In medieval Europe, religion wasn't a belief system. It was Wi-Fi. Everyone was connected. No one understood how it worked, and if you lost signal, you were probably going to hell. The church wasn't just a Sunday thing. It was government, news, healthcare, and moral surveillance all rolled into one judgmental package. Every hour of your day belonged to God, and his middle management was everywhere. There were monks counting sins, priests collecting tithes, bishops hoarding gold, and the Pope sitting in Rome like the CEO of Eternal Consequences, Inc. Now, you might think your modern rational brain can handle this. You've read books. You understand science. Please don't. The moment you say something like, actually the Earth goes around the sun, congratulations. You've invented heresy. That's a one-way ticket to an audience with a man holding a torch and a very poor understanding of astronomy. Even asking questions was dangerous. If you wondered aloud why prayers didn't cure the plague, you were doubting divine will. If you asked why the priest owned 3 horses while you couldn't afford a loaf of bread, you were testing God. The only safe phrases to say were Amen, and God works in mysterious ways, preferably while backing away slowly. And don't even think about skipping church. Attendance wasn't optional. Bells rang, everyone dropped what they were doing, and off you went to spend 3 hours listening to sermons in Latin, a language nobody understood except the priest, who was usually drunk anyway. If you didn't show up, the neighbours would notice. And in medieval Europe, the neighbours noticed is how every execution starts. The church controlled education, money, medicine, and most importantly, fear. That's how it stayed in charge for 1,000 years. Not by convincing people it was right, but by making sure no one lived long enough to prove it wrong. So if you time travel back, remember this. Don't debate theology, don't mention science, and definitely don't say, I'm spiritual, but not religious. They'll think it's Latin for, please light me on fire. If you catch anything in medieval Europe, a cough, a rash, or just a vague sense of doom, I have some excellent advice. Don't go to the doctor. That's because doctor in the 14th century didn't mean someone who saves your life. It meant someone with a book, a robe, and a hammering sense of confidence. These were men who genuinely believed disease was caused by demons, bad smells, or an unfortunate alignment of Mars and your liver. Their treatments were bold, creative, and catastrophically wrong. Got a fever? You're too hot. They'll bleed you until you're balanced. Feeling weak? You're too cold. They'll set you on fire metaphorically or literally. If you have a headache, their first solution is drilling a small hole in your skull to let the evil spirits out. The success rate was approximately none. Hospitals existed, but you didn't want to visit them. They were basically waiting rooms for the afterlife. Crowded, loud, and conveniently located next to cemeteries for faster service. Monks ran most of them, which meant half the medicine you received was prayer, and the other half was bleeding you while asking if you'd sinned recently. Surgery was performed without anesthesia, gloves, or the faintest idea of sanitation. Instruments weren't cleaned, they were wiped on the nearest tunic and reused until they broke or screamed. If you survived surgery, congratulations, you now had a new infection to die from. Dentistry was handled by barbers because why not? You'd go in for a shave and leave missing half your jaw. These were the same men who'd also happily amputate your leg and then offer you a discount on a haircut. So if you get sick while time travelling, resist the urge to seek help. Rest, drink ale, and pray to every available deity. It's not that medieval doctors were evil. They were just aggressively confident in centuries of nonsense. Remember, in the Middle Ages, medicine wasn't about curing disease. It was about surviving the treatment long enough to regret it. If you think showing up in medieval Europe wearing your favourite hoodie will make you blend in, let me save your life. It won't. You might as well tattoo "Suspicious Stranger" on your forehead. Because in the Middle Ages, fashion was a crime scene, and the authorities had receipts. Europe had what were called sumptuary laws, legal dress codes designed to keep everyone in their social lane. The idea was simple. If you're poor, you'd better look poor. No bright colours, no fancy fabric, no jewellery unless you stole it. Even the wrong type of hat could get you fined, flogged, or both. These laws weren't just suggestions, they were moral statements. Silk, for nobles only. Fur, for people who owned land, not goats. Velvet, reserved for anyone rich enough to pay someone else to be cold for them. The rules were so specific that even buttons could betray you. Some towns literally had ordinances on how shiny your belt buckle was allowed to be. So if you time travel in wearing polyester or, God forbid, sneakers, you'll break at least 3 medieval commandments before breakfast. Your futuristic fabrics will make you look like a demon or, worse, a flamboyant merchant. Either way, the local priest will want a word. Even the upper classes weren't safe. Nobles competed over who could look more impractically wealthy. Long, pointy shoes were the fashion. So long, in fact, they had to be tied to the knees with string. Some were nearly 2 feet long. Medieval men were basically walking around dressed like aggressive ducks. Women had it no better. Their gowns could weigh 30 pounds and drag through mud long enough to collect souvenirs. Corsets? Not yet. But good luck breathing under 10 layers of wool. The best survival strategy? Dress like a peasant, brown, itchy, and unmemorable. Your goal is to look like background furniture, the kind that coughs quietly and gets ignored by passing knights. So remember, in medieval Europe, fashion wasn't self-expression. It was self-incrimination. Blend in, stay drab, and if someone compliments your outfit, apologize. That's not flattery, it's evidence. You might think medieval Europe is full of charming creatures, loyal dogs, fluffy cats, majestic horses trotting through the mist. That's the fairy tale version. The real version bites, kicks, infects, or screams at you. Do not pet anything that moves. Let's start with dogs. Forget man's best friend. Medieval dogs were working animals, lean, scarred, and emotionally unavailable. They hunted rats, guarded barns, and occasionally dined on whatever died first. They weren't good boys. They were furry survivalists with mange. If you tried to call one over and say, "Who's a good boy?" the answer was, "Not him. Cats." You might think they'd be safer. They weren't. They were half wild, perpetually furious, and considered suspicious by the church. People actually killed cats for being witches' familiars, which led to, surprise, more rats, more fleas, and eventually the Black Death. Congratulations, humanity. You murdered pest control. Horses were just as bad. You may imagine gallant knights riding noble steeds. In reality, horses were unpredictable tanks with teeth. They bit, kicked, and bolted at the first sign of a spoon dropping. A medieval warhorse could trample you out of pure boredom. You'd have better odds cuddling a bear. Farm animals were worse. Chickens weren't cute. They were tiny feathered sociopaths. Pigs were intelligent, but their intelligence mainly went into figuring out how to eat you if you tripped. Sheep? Constantly plotting to die of fright. Geese? Walking security systems powered by hatred and disease. Oh, the disease. Rabies, ringworm, lice, fleas, worms. Every creature carried something you don't want. Petting a random animal was basically medieval roulette. You either got bitten, infected, or accused of witchcraft for charming the beast. If you time travel back and feel lonely, resist the urge to bond with local fauna. Animals in the Middle Ages weren't companions. They were co-workers who didn't like you. You'll meet pigs smarter than peasants, dogs meaner than knights, and cats who've seen things that make hell look cosy. So say distance, because in medieval Europe, every animal is either dinner, disease, or demon, and you don't want to find out which is which. If you plan to smile in medieval Europe, don't. Teeth were less a body part and more a short-term rental. Dentistry, as we know it, didn't exist, at least not in a form any sane person would recognise. Oral hygiene was a rumour, and most people's mouths looked like archaeological digs from hell. Toothbrushes? None. Toothpaste? Not invented. Mouthwash? Occasionally vinegar, but mostly regret. Peasants chewed on twigs or rinsed with wine, which sounds fancy until you remember the wine was made in a bucket. The rich had better access to dentistry, which usually meant some barber named Gregor yanking your molar out with pliers he'd just used to sharpen a sword. Barbers were the go-to medical professionals because they had tools and the confidence of men who'd never studied anatomy. You could walk into a shop for a trim and leave missing both your hair and your sense of trust. Their logic was simple. If it hurts, remove it. If it still hurts, bleed you. If you die, that's on your humours. Tooth decay was rampant. Sugar was rare, but bread, beer, and plague stress took their toll. By 30, most people had gums that resembled battlefield terrain. Nobles didn't fare better. They just hid it behind perfume and prayer. A healthy smile was such a rarity that chronic halitosis probably counted as a personality trait. And there were no fillings, no anaesthetics, no antibiotics. If your tooth hurt, you prayed. If that failed, you went to a blacksmith who'd help by heating an iron and applying it to your jaw. This, apparently, cured the pain because you stopped caring about your teeth entirely. So if you're time travelling, protect your mouth like it's your soul. Don't eat the bread, it's basically gravel. Don't drink the water, it's basically poison. And don't trust anyone holding tongs. Keep your mouth closed. It's the most valuable treasure you've got, because in medieval Europe, everyone loses their teeth. Some lose them naturally, others lose them to medicine. But either way, by the end of your trip, you'll be gumming your ale and smiling through the pain. Historically accurate, if nothing else. If you're time travelling to medieval Europe, remember this golden rule. Everything you eat is trying to kill you. The diet wasn't so much farm to table as hope to God it's edible. Let's start with bread, the universal staple and the leading cause of dental trauma. Medieval bread was dense, dark, and baked from grain so coarse it could double as sandpaper. The poorest made loaves with barley, rye, and occasionally crushed peas or acorns. Sometimes they added filler, which was a charming euphemism for sawdust, weeds, or whatever was lying near the mill. It wasn't food, it was survival in loaf form. If you were lucky enough to eat meat, congratulations. You were probably nobility, or robbing one. The meat wasn't fresh either. It was smoked, salted, or slightly haunted. Refrigeration didn't exist, so aging was just what happened when you forgot to bury the pig fast enough. Spices were used not for flavour, but for camouflage. If your dinner smelled suspiciously like cinnamon, it meant someone was hiding the decay. Vegetables? A peasant luxury. Nobles avoided them entirely. Too common, too earthy. They preferred heavily spiced dishes that looked impressive and tasted like moral punishment. Meanwhile, peasants lived on pottage, a stew that evolved perpetually in the same pot for months. You'd throw in barley, cabbage and despair, boil it for 6 hours and call it dinner. It was said a good pottage could survive generations, and probably did. Dessert was rare unless you considered fermented apples and regret a delicacy. Sweets required sugar, which cost a fortune. Most people's idea of a treat was bread soaked in ale, the medieval equivalent of cake if you hate yourself. And don't forget the cutlery, or rather, the lack of it. Forks were foreign nonsense, knives were communal, and spoons were shared like bacteria exchange programs. Eating with your hands was normal. Washing those hands before eating was optional. So, if you find yourself in a medieval feast hall, eat slowly, pretend to enjoy it, and try not to think about expiration dates. Everything's boiled, salted, or possibly moving. In medieval Europe, fresh meant hasn't killed anyone yet. Bon appetit. If you think medieval Europe was full of noble kings and wise rulers, Allow me to ruin that fantasy. It was actually full of people getting executed for thinking about kings and rulers. So here's the best advice for your trip through the Middle Ages. Keep your head down, unless you'd like to lose it. Politics in medieval Europe made no sense. You could go to bed under one king and wake up under another, and neither of them knew where your village was. Loyalty wasn't rewarded, it was punished. Swear allegiance to the wrong noble, and congratulations, you've just committed treason in advance. Monarchs changed faster than tavern prices. Assassinations, coups, poisonings, accidental hunting trips. Royal deaths were basically a spectator sport. It didn't matter who you supported. You were always on the losing side. Even cheering could get you killed. People were executed for clapping at the wrong time, and don't think being quiet will save you. Spies were everywhere. In markets, churches, taverns, even your own home. Gossip travelled faster than hygiene. One wrong comment about taxes, and suddenly you're a threat to the crown. They didn't need evidence, just enthusiasm. You could be executed politely. Public beheadings were entertainment. People brought their kids. Vendors sold snacks. Come see the traitor lose his head was basically medieval Netflix. And the worst part? Sometimes the axe didn't work properly. It could take multiple swings. You'd die knowing the crowd was getting bored. If you were noble, your execution was at least fancy. You got a private scaffold and maybe a priest. But if you were a commoner, you were lucky to get decapitated. The default setting was hanging, burning, or being tied to something uncomfortable. So, what's the survival strategy? Don't speak. Don't choose sides. Don't look like you have opinions. When nobles argue, stare at your shoes. When they ask where you're from, say, around. Never say, the future. That's heresy and treason. A 2-for-1 deal at the gallows. In short, keep your head down, your mouth shut, and your passport hidden. In medieval Europe, silence isn't just golden. It's life insurance. If you somehow survive the plague, bad bread, and casual executions, your next challenge will be conversation. Medieval Europe loved to talk, just never about anything safe, which is why you should learn one very important phrase before time travelling. Nescio. It means, I don't know, and you should use it constantly. The Middle Ages were full of arguments you couldn't win, because facts didn't exist yet. You're a 21st century traveller surrounded by people who think thunder is God bowling, and that babies are conceived via divine lightning bolt. You might feel tempted to correct them. Don't. That's how Galileo ended up on house arrest for having a telescope. If a monk asks what you think about the Trinity, say Nescio. If a scholar asks whether the earth moves, say Nescio. If a peasant asks why their cow exploded, definitely say Nescio. Any attempt to explain science will get you branded as either a sorcerer or French, and neither is survivable. Medieval intellectual debates were terrifying. They didn't involve ideas. They involved stakes, torches, and accusations. Philosophy wasn't about discovery. It was about seeing who could quote Aristotle without getting set on fire. The smartest man in the room was usually the one pretending to be illiterate. Latin was the language of the educated elite, priests, lawyers, and anyone who could afford to be wrong in multiple syllables. But for you, it's a shield. Say Nescio with conviction, bow a little, and they'll think you're humble or foreign, not dangerous. And in this world, humble foreigners live longer than clever locals. If you're dragged into a theological debate, and you will be, remember that reason is not your friend. You can't outlogic faith with science that won't be discovered for another 500 years. When someone insists disease is caused by sin, the correct response is not actually bacteria. It's Nescio, followed by intense nodding. So practice it now. Nescio, Nescio, Nescio. It's not ignorance, it's survival. Because in medieval Europe, the less you know, the less you burn. In the 21st century, you live by clocks. In medieval Europe, you live by bells. And they're not asking, they're commanding. If you hear one, drop whatever you're doing. The bell is God's version of a push notification. Bells ruled everything. They woke you up, told you when to pray, when to work, when to confess, and when to panic because someone's house was on fire. Every town had at least one church tower, and its bell rang so often that silence was considered suspicious. The day was carved into chunks of noise. Matins, lauds, prime, terce, sext, none, vespers, and compline. Basically divine interval training for the soul. Monks took this very seriously. Their entire lives were synchronized by bells like spiritual factory workers. At 3 a.m, the bell rang for matins, and everyone rolled out of bed to chant in Latin for 2 hours. At 6 a.m, another bell told them to eat bread that tasted like despair. Then back to chanting. It's a wonder anyone found time to sin. Peasants, meanwhile, didn't need a watch. They had trauma. The bells told them when to plough, when to rest, when to pay taxes, and when to beg for forgiveness for complaining about taxes. When the bells rang, everyone obeyed. They didn't ask why. They just knew someone important, possibly God, possibly Gregor the bell ringer, had decided it was time to stop having fun. Bells weren't just for prayers. They signalled danger, weddings, executions, royal visits, or plague outbreaks. If the bell sounded at an odd hour, panic was the correct emotional response. Some bells rang so often they developed names and personalities. Big Tom, Great Peter, the Waker of the Dead. And they weren't exaggerating. These things could be heard for miles. If you're time travelling, your first instinct might be to ignore them. Don't. That's like ignoring fire alarms in a fireworks factory. If the bell rings, follow the crowd. Don't ask questions. Don't make jokes about alarm fatigue. The medieval mind doesn't understand sarcasm, only obedience. In medieval Europe, the bell doesn't just tell time, it owns it. If you thought medieval Europe was all chivalry, serenades and moonlit castle balconies, congratulations, you've been catfished by centuries of bad poetry. Romance in the Middle Ages was less Romeo and Juliet and more catch feelings, catch the plague. Let's start with the basics. Marriage wasn't about love. It was about land, livestock, and alliances, the holy trinity of disappointment. Nobles didn't marry for affection. They married for acreage. Your spouse was chosen when you were about 6, and your wedding vows were legally binding property contracts disguised as spiritual devotion. If you were a peasant, things weren't better, just cheaper. Courtship involved less poetry and more mud. You'd meet someone while milking a cow, exchange a few shy glances, and boom. You're married because the village priest needed something to do that week. Flirting, on the other hand, was dangerous. If you complimented the wrong person, congratulations. You've just triggered a blood feud. Nobles defended honour the way modern people defend Wi-Fi passwords. A single misplaced smile could get you stabbed, fined, or dragged before the local lord for intent to woo above your station. Romantic ambition was practically a death wish. And affairs? Oh, absolutely. They happened all the time. Discretion didn't. Every noble court was a soap opera with chainmail. But if you got caught, the punishment depended on your gender. Men were scolded, women were executed, and priests took notes for their next sermon. There were songs, of course. Courtly love, the idea that a knight could pine for a married lady without consequences. It was poetic, dramatic, and completely fictional. In reality, knights were filthy, women were exhausted, and troubadours were banned from at least 3 duchies at any given time. If you time travel to medieval Europe, keep your heart, and your eyes, to yourself. Complimenting a noble's wife means execution. Flirting with a peasant's daughter means lynching. Even smiling too long could get you excommunicated for lustful gazing. In short, romance is fatal. The safest relationship you'll have in the Middle Ages is with your straw mattress, though even that comes with splinters. So stay single, stay silent, and stay alive. In medieval Europe, love at first sight was usually followed by trial at first light. If you somehow survive medieval food, politics, and romance, congratulations, you're now ready for everyone's favourite community activity, the witch hunt. Think of it as a medieval talent show, except the talent is dying creatively. In the Middle Ages, witch hunts were the perfect storm of boredom, fear, and bad theology. The weather was bad, crops failed, and people needed someone to blame who wasn't the local lord. Enter the witch, usually an old woman with a cat, arthritis, and the audacity to live alone. The logic was flawless. If your cow stopped producing milk, a witch cursed it. If your child sneezed twice, witchcraft. If your bread burned, witchcraft. If your bread didn't burn, especially witchcraft. The only person not accused was the actual idiot who left the oven unattended. Trials were generous affairs. You'd be tied up, thrown into a river, and told that if you floated, you were a witch. If you sank and drowned, congratulations, you were innocent. This was considered fair. Either way, the church got to keep your property, so it was a win-win for everyone except you. Witch-finders were professionals, self-appointed experts with impressive titles and questionable literacy. They'd inspect moles, freckles, or birthmarks as devil's marks. Basically, if you had skin, you were guilty. They also used needles to test if you felt pain. If you didn't scream, you were a witch. If you did, they said you screamed like a witch. So what should you do as a time traveller? Easy. Blend in. Don't heal anyone. Don't use herbs. Don't even know herbs. If someone gets sick, say God's will, not maybe it's bacteria. Don't own a cat. Don't talk to birds. And for the love of all that's holy, don't float. Witch hunts weren't rare. They were entertainment. People showed up with snacks. The church called it justice. Nobles called it order. And peasants called it a nice day out. So if the crowd starts gathering torches and shouting witch, walk away. Fast. Because in medieval Europe, everyone's a witch until proven drowned. There are sounds you never forget. Church bells, clanging swords, a suspicious cough. And then there's this one. Bring out your dead. If you hear that in medieval Europe, don't stick around to see what happens next. It's not a parade. It's not a sale. It's the Black Death, the world's least festive block party. The plague hit in waves, and every time it did, people lost their collective minds. Cities emptied. Villages vanished. The average street looked like a horror movie filmed with a shovel. And since nobody understood germs, they blamed everything else. Jews, witches, bad smells, and the position of Mars. Basically, everything except the rats and fleas literally crawling over their faces. When the carts rolled through town, they were collecting bodies. No gloves, no masks, no sense of self-preservation. Just men shouting, "Bring out your dead," while stepping over yesterday's quota. If you were lucky, you died fast. If not, you got to enjoy a week of fever, black boils, and spiritual panic before joining the pile. Doctors, if you can call them that, wore long beaked masks stuffed with herbs, because apparently lavender could stop divine wrath. These plague doctors looked like goth storks and were about as effective. They carried sticks to poke patients from a distance, which honestly was the smartest medical decision of the century. The living didn't fare much better. People fled cities, abandoning family and reason. Some turned to prayer, others to alcohol. A few decided the world was ending and joined flagellant cults that whipped themselves through town like sinners on parade. Spoiler, it didn't help. So if you time travel to medieval Europe and hear that infamous call echoing through the fog, do not investigate. Do not offer help. Do not Google symptoms. Just leave, quietly, quickly, preferably in the opposite direction of the coughing. Because in the Middle Ages, there's no such thing as safe distance. The plague travels faster than gossip, and it doesn't need an invitation. If you value your life, or your skin tone, respect the cart and keep moving. Remember, curiosity didn't just kill the cat. In the 14th century, it killed everyone. So you've made it through the filth, famine, and fever. You've blended in, you smell like despair, and you've mastered the art of not dying. Naturally, you start to think, hey, maybe medieval life isn't so bad. That's your first mistake. Because the moment you relax, something terrible happens. Maybe the harvest fails. Maybe the local baron decides to start a war over a goat. Maybe the sky darkens and everyone starts chanting in Latin because a comet showed up, and clearly that means apocalypse. In medieval Europe, comfort isn't a feeling. It's an omen. You could spend years surviving plagues, invasions, and suspicious bread, only to wake up one morning and discover you're now owned by someone named Lord Geoffrey the Slightly Moist. Your home, his. Your livestock, also his. Your freedom, optional. And if you complain, congratulations, you're a heretic and a socialist. Even peace wasn't peaceful. Fires broke out constantly because everything was made of wood and optimism. Floods drowned half the countryside at least once a decade. The rest of the time, people were freezing, starving, or waiting for someone to invent soap. And if you think moving to a castle will help, think again. Castles were basically drafty stone refrigerators full of angry nobles and indoor smoke. You'd die slower, but not happier. Peasants had at least the dignity of freezing outside. The truth is, no one in the Middle Ages was comfortable. They were alive, temporarily, painfully, and usually against their will. But they were also stubbornly human, laughing, drinking, singing badly, and finding joy in a world that constantly tried to kill them. There's something admirable about that, in a tragic, lice-infested sort of way. So when you time travel home, do yourself a favour. Take a hot shower, brush your teeth, and marvel at your miracle of indoor plumbing. Then light a candle for the poor souls who never got to complain about traffic or Wi-Fi, because comfort, the kind we take for granted, is the one luxury nobody in medieval Europe ever truly had. The Roman arena was not a place of mercy. Beneath the blinding sun and roaring crowds, men fought for their lives, their sweat mixing with sand and blood. But every so often, a hush would fall over the mob, a different kind of awe replacing the usual hunger for gore, because stepping into the arena were not burly, scarred men, but women. They were called gladiatrices, female gladiators, and their very existence challenged everything Rome believed about gender, honour, and spectacle. These women were the empire's secret fascination. Dressed like Amazons, bare-armed, often with one breast exposed in symbolic imitation of the mythical warrior women, they fought with elegance and ferocity. Bronze greaves shimmered against oiled legs. Helms adorned with plumes or feathers hid their faces, but not their determination. For the Romans, who saw female modesty as a virtue and public combat as a man's duty, the sight was both thrilling and disturbing. Most gladiatrices were not volunteers. Many were slaves or prisoners of war, condemned to entertain the public through violence. Yet a few came of their own free will, noble women drawn by fame, rebellion, or desire for forbidden freedom. Ancient writers like Juvenal mocked these upper-class women, sneering that they threw away the distaff for the sword. But the truth was that the arena gave them something Roman society never could, a taste of equality, however brutal. They trained in special schools, learning the arts of sword, shield, and trident. Imagine the clang of steel, the rhythm of footwork, the measured breathing before a strike. They sparred just as the men did, earning the right to step onto the sands of the amphitheatre, where life and death were separated by the turn of a thumb. Their matches were often lit by torches, staged as exotic spectacles, half theatre, half slaughter. The audience gawked not only at their skill, but at the sheer audacity of women fighting like men. And though the empire tried to erase them from history, faint traces remain. A marble relief in Halicarnassus showing two women, Amazon and Achillea, raising their arms in salute, an inscription honouring a female fighter who fought bravely and was freed. They were rare, but real, and for a brief, defiant moment, they made the arena their own. Training to become a gladiatrix was a brutal transformation, a descent into discipline, pain, and performance. For most women who entered the ludus or gladiator school, life as they knew it ended at the gate. Once inside, They were no longer wives, slaves, or nobles. They were fighters in the making, property of the arena, shaped by the lanista, the trainer who ruled their fates. The training grounds were relentless. Wooden swords first, to learn form and balance, then heavier weapons, meant to build strength and endurance. They practiced strikes, parries, and footwork under the merciless eye of their instructors. The air reeked of sweat and iron. Every mistake was corrected with a shout or a blow. But in time, rhythm replaced hesitation. A woman who once carried baskets or spun wool could now swing a gladius with precision deadly enough to split bone. Diet was part of their conditioning too. Contrary to popular myth, gladiators, male and female, were not sculpted warriors of lean muscle. They ate thick barley porridge, beans and ashes, building a soft layer of fat that protected their organs from shallow cuts. The irony was almost poetic. The empire that glorified beauty and perfection bred its champions from roughness and scars. Still, training wasn't just about fighting, it was theatre. Gladiatrices learned to fight with style. A dramatic entrance, a taunting pose, a deliberate pause before the final strike. These weren't just flourishes, they were strategy. The crowd demanded drama, not efficiency. The lanista would often pit them against exotic beasts or foreign fighters, choreographing their deaths and victories for maximum spectacle. And despite being outnumbered by male fighters, gladiatrices earned the respect of their peers. Many of the men, initially dismissive, learned quickly not to underestimate them. Strength could be matched, but speed and cunning, those were their true weapons. Some records mention that female recruits were even trained in the Ludus Magnus, the main gladiator school near the Colosseum, where emperors themselves sometimes came to watch practice bouts. There, a few gladiatrices became local legends, known by nicknames like Amazona or Livia the Blade. Every drop of blood spilled in training brought them closer to the arena, a stage where they would fight not just for survival, but for the impossible dream of being remembered. When the day of the games arrived, the city pulsed with anticipation. Banners fluttered above the amphitheatre, drums thundered through the streets, and the smell of roasting meat and sweat hung thick in the air. From dawn until dusk, tens of thousands gathered to watch Rome's greatest obsession, death as entertainment. But when the announcer called out the names of female gladiators, the crowd's roar changed. It became something between shock, amusement, and lust. The women entered the arena with deliberate grace, their armour gleaming beneath the sun or torchlight. To the Romans, it was a scandal wrapped in spectacle. They weren't supposed to be there. Women were meant to adorn temples, not desecrate them with blood. And yet here they were, warriors draped in mythic symbolism, some dressed as Amazons from Greek legend, others bare-shouldered and defiant. Their presence alone was a form of rebellion. The games followed ritual. Trumpets blared, the emperor gave a signal, and the match began. The women fought with surprising ferocity, shields clashing, swords flashing, sand kicking up beneath their sandals. Each movement was deliberate, not only to survive, but to entertain. The crowd demanded artistry and violence, and the gladiatrices delivered. Every feint, every strike, every dodge was theatre written in blood. They fought against other women, sometimes against men, and occasionally against wild beasts. Lions, boars, even leopards were released into the arena. The audience gasped as silk-haired women stood their ground against fanged death. And though most fights ended in mercy or exhaustion rather than slaughter, the line between performance and mortality was thin and cruel. Roman writers recorded these spectacles with a mix of fascination and disgust. Cassius Dio wrote of Emperor Domitian hosting nighttime games where women battled by torchlight, their bodies gleaming with oil and sweat under the flicker of flame. It was both erotic and horrifying, a calculated contradiction that kept Rome's citizens enthralled. For the gladiatrix, each match was a gamble, death, disgrace, or glory. Some were slain and forgotten. Others fought so bravely that the crowd demanded their freedom, chanting Missio, release. In those moments, as the crowd thundered approval, and the emperor raised his hand. A woman who had been property became, briefly, a legend. To understand the allure of the female gladiator, one must look to the myth that inspired her, the Amazon. For the Romans, Amazons were both fantasy and fear. Women who fought, conquered, and lived without men. They existed in art, in poetry, and on the walls of villas, representing everything that Rome both admired and despised in the feminine spirit. When female fighters entered the arena dressed like these mythical warriors, they brought those fantasies to life. Artists and organisers leaned heavily into this imagery. Gladiatrices were often given stage names like Achillea, Amazon, or Penthesilea, directly invoking the heroines of Greek legend. Their armour, deliberately stylised, mimicked the look of mythic Amazons: bare arms, one breast uncovered, short tunics that allowed for movement and left little to the imagination. It was deliberate theatre. The audience was meant to see them not just as women, but as symbols of something untamed and dangerous. But beneath the symbolism was a quiet irony. The Amazons were said to have lived in lands beyond civilization, Scythia, the fringes of the known world. They were barbarians, according to Roman ideals. So when the empire paraded its own women as Amazons, it was both a spectacle and a statement of control, a reminder that Rome could tame even its myths, forcing them to fight and die for the crowd's pleasure. The women themselves, however, often embodied the opposite of submission. Whether enslaved or free, their mere presence in the arena defied centuries of Roman moral codes. They blurred the lines between virtue and vice, shame and courage. Some in the audience may have laughed or jeered, but others, perhaps secretly, felt admiration. Roman poets like Statius described these fighters with fascination, unable to decide whether to condemn or worship them. They were monstrous, he wrote, yet irresistible. Their duality mirrored the Amazon myth itself, half nightmare, half fantasy. Statues and mosaics from the eastern provinces captured this fascination in stone and colour. Women with swords poised mid-swing, muscles tense, faces serene. These depictions were not of victims, but of equals, warriors carved in the language of defiance. And for a brief, shimmering moment, the gladiatrix became more than myth or novelty. She became the living Amazon of Rome, an embodiment of rebellion gilded in bronze and blood. Winning in the arena was more than survival, it was transformation. For a gladiatrix, a victory could mean food, gifts, fame, and in rare cases, freedom. In a world where most women's names were lost to history, these few became whispered legends. Their stories passed from tavern to tavern, from senator to slave. When a female fighter won a match, the arena erupted. Flowers were thrown into the sand. Men shouted her name with drunken admiration. Some patrons carved her likeness on oil lamps and pottery, capturing the moment when she stood over her fallen opponent, sword raised high. To the Romans it was both shocking and seductive, a woman commanding attention, power, and applause. The greatest honour a gladiatrix could achieve was missio, official release from combat, granted by the emperor or the crowd. The wooden sword, the rudis, symbolised her freedom. Few ever reached that point, but those who did were immortalised. Inscriptions have been found celebrating women who fought bravely and were freed. These were not meek housewives, they were conquerors of men and fate. But fame in the arena came with a dark cost. The empire's moralists despised the sight of women who sought glory in combat. Philosophers and senators ranted that such displays corrupted Roman virtue. "When women fight," wrote one critic, "modesty dies." It was more than outrage, it was fear. The idea of women embracing power, violence, and public admiration threatened the social order. Even emperors were torn. Domitian adored hosting spectacles featuring women fighters, while later rulers condemned them. Under Emperor Septimius Severus, in the early 3rd century CE, the ban became law. Women were forbidden from entering the arena. Rome had indulged its fantasy for too long, and now it recoiled from what it had created. Many gladiatrices faded into obscurity, their victories erased by decree, their names chipped off monuments, their images buried in sand. But their legacy endured, in fragments of marble, in graffiti praising their skill, and in the myths they embodied. They were more than curiosities of entertainment. They were women who, for a fleeting moment, seized the kind of power Rome told them they could never have, and forced the empire to look at them, not as ornaments, but as warriors. By the 3rd century CE, the days of the gladiatrix were numbered. Rome was changing. Its empire stretched thin, its moral compass shifting from spectacle to self-control. The same elite who once paid fortunes to watch women duel beneath torchlight began to call it a disgrace. What had once been thrilling now seemed obscene, and the emperors, ever mindful of appearances, moved to erase it. Emperor Septimius Severus struck the final blow. Around 200 CE, he issued a decree forbidding women from performing in the arena. His official reason was moral reform, an effort to restore the dignity of Roman womanhood. But beneath the rhetoric was something deeper: fear. The sight of women fighting, and sometimes winning, undermined the patriarchal image of the empire. A female victor in the arena was not merely entertainment, she was an embarrassment to every Roman who believed that women should stay silent, obedient, and unseen. Senators praised the ban, hailing it as a return to virtue. Poets lamented the decay of modesty. The same hands that had thrown roses now signed edicts of condemnation. The public, however, was divided. Some missed the thrill, the novelty of women who moved with the grace of dancers and struck with the precision of killers. Others whispered that Rome had become weak, that the empire which once celebrated strength now cowered behind moral laws. The ban did not silence everyone. Evidence suggests that in smaller provincial arenas, female fighters continued to appear for years afterward, sometimes disguised as men, sometimes openly defying the law. The empire was vast, and decrees from Rome travelled slowly. In frontier towns, governors cared less about ethics and more about drawing crowds. There, the spirit of the gladiatrix refused to die, but over time, as Christianity spread and the games themselves began to fade, the memory of these women slipped into myth. Chroniclers ignored them, or twisted their stories into moral warnings. The marble reliefs that once depicted their triumphs were buried or broken. By the time the Colosseum's gates closed for good, few remembered that women had ever fought there at all. Yet even in erasure, they endured. Their silence became its own rebellion, a ghostly reminder that once, in the heart of Rome, women stood unflinching beneath the eyes of emperors and gods. When the gladiatrices vanished from the arena, Rome did what it always did with inconvenient truths. It rewrote them. Historians spoke of mighty generals and noble men, but the women who had bled in the sand were quietly erased. Their names faded from scrolls, their faces from frescoes. What survived was fragmentary, a marble relief here, an inscription there, whispers of a time when women dared to fight under the empire's gaze. One of the most striking relics is the Halicarnassus relief, showing two female fighters, Amazon and Achillea. Both stand proud, weapons raised, their bodies lean and strong. The inscription below declares the match a draw, an outcome of mutual respect, rare in the arena's cruel arithmetic. These were not slaves dying for amusement. They were equals, warriors whose skill commanded the crowd's admiration. Archaeologists have also uncovered graffiti and mosaics depicting women in armour, their identities long lost but their postures unmistakably defiant. Each artifact is a ghostly reminder that their existence was real, not legend. And yet, for centuries, scholars dismissed them as allegory, as artistic fantasy. It was easier to believe in mythic Amazons than to accept that Roman women once wielded swords in truth. This erasure was no accident. The empire's moralists, and later the early Christian chroniclers, sought to cleanse history of such transgressions. A woman who fought for blood and honour did not fit the narrative of obedience and piety they wanted to preserve. In their eyes, gladiatrices were not heroines but heretics of gender, symbols of Rome's decadence and decline. But history has a way of whispering through the ruins. Modern excavations and re-examinations of ancient texts have brought these women back into the light. Their presence, once denied, now complicates the story of Rome itself. They reveal an empire far more diverse, daring, and contradictory than its marble monuments suggest. And so, while the Colosseum's stones still stand, they hold within them echoes of women whose courage defied centuries of silence. Their memory may be fractured, but it endures, etched in the grit of the arena floor, in the glint of a bronze sword, and in the enduring truth that power, once seized, can never be entirely erased. Centuries after the last torch burned out in the Colosseum, the gladiatrix was reborn, not in flesh, but in imagination. Artists, historians, and filmmakers began to rediscover her story, fascinated by the paradox she represented. A woman both enslaved and empowered, brutal yet graceful, a product of Rome's cruelty and her own defiance. What had once been erased from memory now returned as legend. In the Renaissance, scholars studying ancient reliefs stumbled upon depictions of armed women and puzzled over their meaning. Were they mythic Amazons, goddesses, or something more human and more dangerous to the order of history? By the 19th century, archaeologists had confirmed what the ancients once knew. Women had indeed fought in the arena. The revelation scandalized and thrilled the modern world in equal measure. The image of the female gladiator soon took on new forms. Painters portrayed her as both warrior and muse, half Venus, half Mars. Writers turned her into a symbol of rebellion against patriarchal constraint. In the 20th and 21st centuries, she found new life in cinema and literature, from epic films to historical novels, often depicted as a figure of tragic strength or erotic fascination. The gladiatrix had become a cultural mirror, reflecting society's shifting views on power, gender, and spectacle. But behind the fantasy, scholars worked to reclaim her truth. They pieced together evidence, inscriptions, armor fragments, burial remains, to separate myth from reality. They discovered that these women were not anomalies, but part of a broader world where gender roles were less rigid than the marble statues of Roman virtue suggested. Rome's arenas, cruel as they were, had been strange laboratories of equality, where a woman's worth was measured not by her birth, but by her blade. Today, the gladiatrix stands as a symbol of historical defiance. She reminds us that even in the heart of one of history's most patriarchal societies, women found ways to break the rules, to step into the light, and to be seen. She is more than a relic. She is a challenge to the stories we've accepted, to the power structures we still maintain, and to every silence that hides a woman's strength beneath centuries of dust. The arena may be gone, but her shadow still moves through time. The gladiatrices may have vanished from history's stage, but their spirit continues to echo through every age that questions who holds the right to power. In Rome's time, they were outcasts, anomalies that existed between spectacle and scandal. Yet today, they are seen for what they truly were: symbols of resistance, agency, and courage in an empire built on hierarchy. Their legacy is complex, stitched together from broken reliefs, scattered inscriptions, and the uneasy admiration of the men who wrote about them. Ancient moralists tried to frame them as warnings, proof of Rome's moral decay. But modern historians read between those lines. They see women who claimed a fragment of freedom in a world that offered them none, who fought not because they were allowed to, but because they refused to be invisible. The gladiatrix's story reshapes how we see ancient Rome itself. It reveals that beneath the marble statues of virtue and order was a living world full of contradictions. It shows that courage and defiance were not reserved for emperors and generals, but also for the nameless women who stepped into the sand, faced death, and met the crowd's gaze without fear. In modern times, her image has become a rallying cry. Artists, historians, and feminists alike celebrate her as a forgotten ancestor of every woman who has ever defied expectation. From novels to films, she returns again and again, a figure reborn each time society rediscovers its fascination with rebellion. She is the mythic Amazon, the lost warrior, the flame that refuses to die, and perhaps that is the true victory of the gladiatrix. Rome tried to erase her, but could not. Time buried her name, but her story endures in the cracks of history. Each rediscovered inscription, each unearthed mosaic, each reimagined portrayal is an act of resurrection. As the dust of the Colosseum still whispers with the ghosts of the fallen, one can almost imagine their footsteps, the ring of metal, the murmur of the crowd, the defiant lift of a sword. They were slaves, they were rebels, they were legends. And though centuries have passed, their struggle still speaks. In the heart of every woman who dares to stand where she is told she cannot, the spirit of the gladiatrix still fights. To dine with Cleopatra VII was not to attend a meal, it was to enter a vision. Every banquet she held in Alexandria was a spell of power woven from gold, fragrance, and spectacle. She was not a queen in those moments. She was Isis reborn, a living deity who turned the act of dining into an assertion of divinity and dominance. The dining hall itself was a wonder. Walls gilded in gold leaf shimmered in torchlight, while mosaics of lotus and papyrus glowed beneath the feet of her guests. Perfumed smoke drifted through the air, fanned by servants trained to keep its rhythm steady and hypnotic. Bronze braziers burned rare incense from Arabia, frankincense, myrrh, and cinnamon, all precious enough to bankrupt smaller kingdoms. Cleopatra's banquets were not merely feasts of taste, but of scent, sound, and sight. Her guests were the most powerful men in the known world. Roman envoys, Egyptian nobles, philosophers, and generals who came expecting diplomacy, but left questioning whether they dined with a mortal or a goddess. She would recline on a couch draped in Tyrian purple, the colour of royalty, her skin glistening with gold dust, her hair braided with pearls. Even her goblets were made of onyx and studded with emeralds. Each gesture, each glance, was calculated theatre. The menu itself was an empire's inventory. Peacock tongues, roasted ibises, honeyed dates, Nile fish soaked in wine, and loaves stamped with her royal seal. Every dish carried symbolism, abundance, fertility, divine right. The servants poured imported Falernian wine, so old that Roman senators could barely afford to taste it. Cleopatra, of course, drank it as though it were water, and then there was her most infamous act of extravagance, when she allegedly dissolved a priceless pearl in vinegar and drank it before the stunned eyes of her Roman lover, Mark Antony. It was said to be the largest pearl in the world, worth a fortune equal to several provinces. But for Cleopatra, it wasn't about wealth. It was about proving that her power was so absolute that she could consume the riches of empires in a single swallow. In her world, opulence was a language, and every feast was a proclamation that Egypt's queen ruled not just by crown, but by awe. Cleopatra's banquets were not private indulgences. They were theatre, carefully staged performances meant to seduce, intimidate, and enthrall. She understood that to rule Egypt in the shadow of Rome required more than armies and treaties. It required spectacle. And no stage was more potent than her dining table. The queen used banquets as her battlefield. Where Caesar or Antony might have used soldiers to win loyalty, Cleopatra used charm, intellect, and display. The guests who entered her palace did so as equals, or so they thought. By the end of the evening, they left as worshippers. Everything was designed to remind them of her divine nature. Even the order of seating carried meaning. Cleopatra at the centre, reclining on her gilded couch, while everyone else occupied lower positions, literally beneath her gaze. It was a quiet act of dominance hidden beneath etiquette. Her timing was impeccable. Dancers, musicians and poets entered at key moments, their performances echoing themes of gods and lovers. A lyre would hum as she raised her cup. Verses about Isis and Osiris would drift through the air just as she smiled at her guest. The audience understood the message. Cleopatra was Isis, and the man beside her, whether Caesar or Antony, played Osiris, her divine consort. The banquet became ritualized seduction. Politics dressed as religion. Even the food followed a script. Dishes arrived not in chaos, but in a deliberate progression, each more elaborate than the last, each a symbol of Egypt's unmatched wealth. When the table groaned under pyramids of fruit and roasted game, it wasn't hunger she satisfied. It was awe. Every serving tray was a reminder that the Nile's abundance flowed through her command. Cleopatra also mastered the art of silence. Between courses, she would listen rather than speak, letting others fill the air with flattery or nervous laughter. It was in those quiet moments that she measured their loyalties and fears. A misplaced word could decide an alliance or a downfall. To outsiders, her banquets seemed decadent beyond reason. But to Cleopatra, they were diplomacy disguised as desire. Each candle, each pearl, each sip of wine was a calculated weapon. The table was her throne room, and her guests were the pawns in a game only she could play to perfection. When Julius Caesar first entered Cleopatra's court, he expected the usual pomp of a foreign ruler. Instead, he found a world that devoured his Roman sense of restraint. Egypt under Cleopatra was alive with colour and luxury, and nowhere was this more visible than in her banquets. For Caesar, used to the stern discipline of Roman dining halls, plain bread, olives, and wine, the Queen's table was an assault on moderation. But that was precisely her intent. Cleopatra knew Rome's psychology. To Romans, Egypt was exotic, decadent, and dangerous, a place where the ordinary became divine. She leaned into that image, turning every dinner into an act of cultural conquest. The banquet she hosted for Caesar in Alexandria was legend: gold utensils, tables carved from rare woods, and fountains that gushed wine instead of water. Each element carried a message. Rome might rule the world with legions, but Egypt ruled its imagination. Caesar was no fool. He saw the performance, yet he was drawn to it. Cleopatra's charm lay not just in her beauty, but in her control of atmosphere. She could make a room feel like Olympus itself. When Caesar reclined beside her, he wasn't a Roman general. He was a god invited to dine among equals. That illusion was her true magic. Their alliance was sealed not with treaties, but with shared indulgence. They feasted beneath ceilings painted like the heavens, surrounded by servants pouring spiced wine into cups shaped like lotus blossoms. Musicians played soft flutes while trained parrots repeated phrases of praise in Greek. Cleopatra's laughter echoed like a spell, delicate, deliberate, and inescapable. Through those banquets, she made Caesar her partner in spectacle. Together they staged public feasts in Alexandria, presenting themselves as living deities, Isis and Osiris reborn. To the Egyptians, it was divine order restored. To the Romans, it was scandal. But Cleopatra understood something deeper than politics. Power is perception. The queen who could make Rome's most feared general recline beneath golden ceilings and drink from her jewelled cups was more than a ruler. She was a force. Caesar returned to Rome not just as a conqueror of Egypt, but as a man who had been conquered by its queen. And the scent of her banquets, the myrrh, the wine, the faint trace of her perfume, followed him home like a haunting memory of power draped in silk. If Julius Caesar was Cleopatra's introduction to Rome, Mark Antony was her masterpiece. Their first feast together wasn't simply a dinner, it was a declaration of dominance wrapped in velvet and wine. Antony, the Roman war hero, arrived expecting to impress Egypt's queen. Instead, Cleopatra met him on her own stage and rewrote the rules of seduction through spectacle. Ancient writers like Plutarch described it vividly. Cleopatra sailed to meet Antony on a barge gilded in gold, its purple sails perfumed with incense, its oars flashing silver in the sunlight. Musicians played as she reclined beneath a canopy of silk, dressed as the goddess Isis. By the time Antony boarded, he was already defeated, not by an army, but by the overwhelming force of theatre. That night, Cleopatra hosted a banquet that would echo through centuries. The tables were inlaid with gems, and the lamps burned cinnamon oil. The floors were strewn with rose petals so thick that servants waded through them. Dishes arrived in waves, roasted birds stuffed with dates and honey, Nile fish glazed in saffron, cakes soaked in wine. Gold goblets overflowed with the finest Falernian vintage, imported from the Roman elite, who now unknowingly served her pleasure. Antony was astonished, then entranced. Here was a queen who could outmatch Rome's power not with soldiers but with splendour. Cleopatra laughed as she wagered that she could spend 10 million sesterces on a single meal. To prove it, she took one of her enormous pearls, worth a kingdom, and dissolved it in vinegar before drinking it calmly. It wasn't a party trick. It was a statement. She was wealth incarnate, a woman whose worth could not be measured in coin or empire. From that moment, Antony belonged to her world. Their feasts became nightly rituals of excess and intimacy, where politics and pleasure merged. They formed their own private society, the inimitable livers, whose creed was indulgence without restraint. They dined until dawn, drank until laughter dissolved into worship, and blurred the line between reality and divinity. To Antony, Cleopatra was no longer a queen. She was the embodiment of power itself, and in the glow of candlelight reflecting off her golden cups, he saw something Rome had never given him: the feeling of being infinite. No single act defined Cleopatra's legend of excess more than the story of the pearl. It was not simply a stunt, it was a performance of power so grand that even Rome trembled at its audacity. The scene unfolded during one of her most extravagant feasts with Mark Antony, a banquet that already defied comprehension. The hall was flooded with gold light, incense heavy as fog, and music soft as sin. The air itself seemed drunk on her wealth. When Antony boasted that no one could surpass the luxury of their feasts, Cleopatra smiled, slowly, dangerously. "I can," she said, "and I will spend 10 million sesterces on a single meal." The guests laughed, assuming it was bravado. But Cleopatra was not a woman who made idle promises. She called for a cup of vinegar, the strong kind favoured by Romans for cleaning wounds and sharpening the appetite. Then she unclasped one of her earrings, a massive pearl, said to be the largest in the world, harvested from the depths of the Red Sea. It glimmered like a captive moon. Without hesitation, she dropped it into the vinegar. The pearl hissed, softened, and dissolved. Cleopatra raised the cup, met Antony's stunned gaze, and drank. In that moment, she wasn't simply flaunting wealth, she was making a statement. What Rome measured in coins, she measured in gesture. To her, value was theatre, and the ultimate act of dominion was to destroy what others worshipped. She could afford to drink empires. Antony, dazzled and defeated, admitted that no one could rival her. Ancient writers claimed that she was about to dissolve the second pearl when he stopped her, both out of awe and terror. The remaining pearl was later cut and placed in the statue of Venus in Rome, a token of her triumph over Roman pride. The tale became immortal, retold by poets and historians alike. Some doubted its truth, others swore it happened exactly as described. But what mattered wasn't whether it was real, it was that it could have been. For Cleopatra, every banquet was myth-making, and that night, with a single swallow, she didn't just outshine Antony, she outshone history itself. In the wake of the Pearl Banquet, Cleopatra and Mark Antony created something that would scandalize Rome for generations, their private society known as the Inimitable Livers. It was not a political alliance, at least not openly. It was a declaration of indulgence, an elite order of pleasure where the rules of Rome no longer applied. Within its walls, the ordinary boundaries between ruler and subject, god and mortal, disappeared in a haze of perfume and excess. Their gatherings began at twilight and stretched until sunrise. The name Inimitable, meaning beyond imitation, was no exaggeration. They dined aboard golden barges drifting on the Nile, surrounded by torchlight reflecting off the water like melted bronze. Perfume was poured into fountains. Musicians played until their fingers bled. Guests wore robes of transparent silk, their faces dusted with gold powder. Cleopatra and Antony presided as living deities, Isis and Dionysus reborn, while slaves scattered petals underfoot with every step they took. Each evening carried a theme. One night the table was laden entirely with rare fish from every corner of the Mediterranean. Another, it was covered with hundreds of roasted birds caught only that morning. Cleopatra delighted in surprise. She would replace cups mid-banquet with ones carved from sapphire, or order the ceiling to rain aromatic oils. For her, pleasure was not passive. It was an art form, an empire of sensation crafted in real time. The inimitable livers didn't simply feast. They mocked restraint itself. They hosted competitions of extravagance, wagering fortunes on who could devise the most outrageous meal. Cleopatra once had an entire hall transformed into a replica of the sea, complete with ships floating in pools of wine. Antony, eager to match her brilliance, staged mock hunts inside the palace, releasing deer and panthers for guests to chase through corridors lined with carpets from Babylon. But beneath the laughter and luxury, there was something deeper, a rebellion against Rome's iron morality. The society's feasts were Cleopatra's ultimate political message, that Egypt's queen answered to no empire but her own. To Rome, their revelry was madness. To Cleopatra, it was mastery, a performance of freedom in a world built on conquest. And within the glow of their midnight feasts, the line between celebration and worship vanished entirely. Cleopatra's feasts dazzled the world, but even divine splendor comes at a cost. Behind the gold, perfume, and laughter lurked exhaustion, political tension, and the slow decay of empire. To maintain such luxury, Egypt's resources strained under the weight of spectacle. Gold from Nubia, spices from Arabia, pearls from India, all poured into Cleopatra's court like tributaries feeding her myth. The queen who dined like a goddess ruled a kingdom that was bleeding itself to maintain her illusion of immortality. The people of Alexandria watched in awe and unease. For the common citizen, the queen's banquets were distant dreams, echoes of a world beyond reach. Yet Cleopatra justified her extravagance as politics, not indulgence. To her, every feast was propaganda, a reminder that Egypt's prosperity flowed through her divine hands. But for those outside the palace, famine was not myth. The Nile's floods had faltered, and whispers began to spread that the queen feasted while her people starved. Rome, ever watchful, twisted her image further. The senators who once bowed before Antony now branded Cleopatra a sorceress, a temptress who bewitched him into madness. They painted her feasts as orgies of sin and corruption, proof that the East was decadent, unfit to rule itself. To them, her pearls and incense were symbols of moral decay, not majesty. Yet within her marble halls, Cleopatra pressed on. She understood the performance could not falter. If she appeared weakened or ordinary, she would lose not only Antony, but Egypt itself. And so the banquets grew grander, the jewels brighter, the theatre more divine. Guests would dine under ceilings that rained gold dust, while invisible servants, hidden behind walls, released bursts of perfume timed perfectly with the rhythm of music. Still, beneath the surface, even Antony began to tire. The endless nights blurred together in wine-soaked haze. The games of indulgence that once bound them now began to feel like chains. Rome was calling him back, and Cleopatra knew that her empire of beauty was only as strong as his devotion. Every sip of wine, every shimmering pearl, every torch-lit feast carried a shadow. The world had mistaken her luxury for madness, but Cleopatra knew it was survival. She wasn't worshipping excess, she was fighting to remain a goddess in a world of conquerors. As the years passed, Cleopatra's banquets began to feel less like celebrations, and more like elegies. The same halls that once echoed with laughter and music now trembled under the weight of anxiety. Rome was coming. Its legions, its senators, its judgment. The feasts that had once proclaimed her divine now seemed to mock her mortality. Yet Cleopatra, ever the performer, refused to dim the spectacle. If she was to lose everything, she would do so draped in gold. When Octavian, Julius Caesar's adopted heir, declared war on Antony and Cleopatra, their feasts took on the tone of defiance. The queen still dined with magnificence, not to celebrate victory, but to deny despair. Each banquet became an act of resistance. The tables remained heavy with food, the incense thick, the music haunting. Guests whispered that Cleopatra dined as though she could will her empire back to glory through sheer splendor, but the illusion was fading. Supplies dwindled, soldiers deserted, and the gold that once flowed like water began to dry up. Antony grew restless, haunted by Rome's rising power and his own fading authority. The two lovers, once radiant in their excess, now feasted in shadows, laughing too loudly, drinking too deeply, desperate to silence the inevitability they both felt, pressing closer with every sunrise. Their last grand banquet was held on the eve of the Battle of Actium. The palace glittered with desperate beauty. Silver lamps burned through the night. Musicians played mournful hymns, and Cleopatra sat beside Antony in garments of pure gold. They toasted not victory, but memory. The memory of what they had built, of nights when the world itself bowed before them. Every bite, every cup of wine was a farewell to the illusion that gods could rule forever. When Actium fell, so did the fantasy. The barges that once floated with music now carried soldiers fleeing in silence. Alexandria would soon burn. Cleopatra's dining halls, stripped of wealth, became tombs of memory. And yet, even in ruin, she never surrendered her stagecraft. When Octavian arrived, he found her surrounded by treasures, seated upon her throne, perfumed and poised, still a queen of spectacle. The world might have taken her crown, but never her theatre. For Cleopatra, the feast never truly ended. It simply changed form. Cleopatra's final banquet was not one of celebration, but of farewell. Alexandria had fallen. Antony lay dying by his own hand, and the queen who once made emperors kneel now faced her last audience, the shadow of Rome itself. Yet even at the edge of death, Cleopatra refused to be seen as conquered. Her final feast was her last act of defiance, her last illusion of divinity. The room was quiet, lit by oil lamps whose flames flickered against walls still faintly scented with myrrh. Her servants, the last of her loyal circle, spread a table of silver platters and ripe fruit, bread still warm from the ovens, and a pitcher of wine dark as blood. It was a pale reflection of the splendor she once commanded, but Cleopatra understood symbolism better than any ruler alive. She would die as she had lived, on her own terms, in ritual, in spectacle. As she reclined on her couch, dressed in royal robes of crimson and gold, she raised her cup and toasted the gods who had long since abandoned her. "Let Rome feast on its victory," she said, her voice calm, her eyes distant. "I will dine with immortals." She drank deeply, her bracelets chiming softly like distant music. When Octavian's envoys arrived, they found her feasting, composed, radiant, and utterly unbroken. Her attendants, Charmian and Iris, stood by her side, silent as statues. On the table sat a basket of figs, beneath which, hidden in folds of linen, coiled the asp, her final guest. Cleopatra's smile did not waver as she reached for it. To the end, she remained the queen of performance. The poison's bite was swift. She reclined upon her couch, serene, as if drifting into sleep. The last thing her attendants saw was a faint smile, a private triumph. Cleopatra had denied Rome its spectacle of humiliation. She would not be paraded through its streets as a trophy. Her death was her masterpiece, an ending staged with the same precision as her banquets, a final gesture of divine theatre. When Octavian entered, he found not a prisoner, but a legend. The gold shimmered. The air still smelled of incense. Cleopatra, Queen of Egypt, had turned death into her last feast, and eternity into her audience. High among the rugged mountains and emerald valleys of ancient Illyria, women were not merely mothers and wives. They were guardians of mystery, keepers of rituals older than the tribes themselves. Their lives moved with the rhythm of the moon, whose pale light they believed bound them to the divine. When night fell and the mountains turned silver, Illyrian women gathered in secret clearings, barefoot on cold earth, to honour the goddess Bindus, protector of water, fertility, and the sacred balance between life and death. The ceremonies began in silence. Torches were planted in the ground, forming a circle around a basin of spring water, which reflected the stars like a mirror. The eldest women, often healers and seers, chanted invocations in a language that was never written, only remembered. Their songs called on the moon to bless their wombs, their crops, and their courage. Younger women followed in dance, their movements fluid yet deliberate, echoing the patterns of rivers and wind. Each gesture carried meaning: a raised hand for birth, a bowed head for the ancestors, a spin for the endless turning of the seasons. Every woman wore charms crafted from bone, bronze, and shells collected along the Adriatic coast. These talismans were believed to ward off barren soil, wandering spirits, and the jealousy of rivals. The most powerful charm of all was a crescent carved from silver or horn, symbolizing Bindus herself. Worn close to the heart, it was said to keep the goddess's favour upon the wearer, ensuring protection through childbirth, storm, and war. Men were forbidden from witnessing these rites. To intrude upon them was to invite divine punishment, or worse, exile. Yet whispers of what happened during these moonlit gatherings spread through the villages. Some claimed the women summoned rain and healed the sick. Others swore that the moonlight itself obeyed their songs. For the Illyrians, these rituals were not superstition, but survival. The mountains were harsh, the winters cruel, and life was often uncertain. Through their sacred customs, women forged unity, strength, and a quiet dominion that no sword could break. Under the glow of the moon, they were no longer daughters or wives. They were priestesses of the earth, bound by song, water, and flame to the spirit of Illyria itself. In the Illyrian world, fertility was not a private matter. It was sacred, celebrated, and bound to the heartbeat of the tribe. To bear children was to ensure survival, but to conceive under the blessing of the gods was to secure favour for generations. Illyrian women carried the weight of this mystery, performing intricate rites that merged sensuality with spirituality. Their rituals were not acts of vanity, but of cosmic duty, echoes of the belief that every birth mirrored the rebirth of the earth itself. The fertility rites took place in spring, when the snow melted from the mountains and rivers swelled with new life. Women gathered before dawn beside sacred wells or forest springs believed to be touched by the goddess Bindus. They bathed in silence, letting the cold water wash away misfortune and awaken the body's hidden energies. Each movement, from the way they cupped the water to how they brushed their hair afterward, followed ancestral instructions whispered across centuries. The women adorned themselves with fresh flowers, wild thyme, violets, and mountain sage. Around their waists, they tied red woolen cords woven during the long winter months, a symbol of life's eternal thread. Some carried carved wooden idols representing male and female forms, which they anointed with milk and honey before burying them beneath fertile soil. To outsiders, it might have looked primitive. To them, it was the act of seeding blessings into the heart of the earth. At the height of the ceremony, the women formed a circle, facing the sunrise. They sang hymns to Bindus, their voices rising and falling like waves, invoking her to open the rivers of the womb and grant prosperity to the tribe. The song was ancient, half prayer and half spell, believed to echo through the mountains until it reached the goddess herself. Once the sun broke over the peaks, The eldest woman poured a libation of mead and goat's milk into the earth, completing the cycle. The women then embraced, laughing, their faces radiant in the morning light. To them, fertility was not just about childbirth. It was about creation in all forms, the sprouting of grain, the return of the herds, the warmth of human love. Through these rites, Illyrian women wove their lives into the very fabric of nature, ensuring that both body and land would remain forever abundant. Every Illyrian village had at least one woman whose hands were said to hold luck itself, the charm maker, or as some called her, the whisperer of metals and bones. These women were more than artisans. They were the spiritual engineers of Illyria, crafting amulets, talismans, and woven spells that blended art, medicine, and magic. To wear one of their creations was to carry a fragment of protection, a silent pact between human and divine. The process of making charms was ritual in itself. The charm maker worked alone, often in a dim hut heavy with the scent of herbs and smoke. Before beginning, she would sprinkle salt on the ground to ward off jealous spirits, and whisper a short incantation to Bindus for steady hands. The materials she chose were never random: bronze for strength, bone for memory, seashells for fertility, and red thread for life's eternal flame. Each object told a story, each knot a promise. When a young woman was about to marry, she visited the charm maker to receive a bekes, a fertility amulet. It usually contained a small pebble from a sacred river wrapped in wool and tied with a hair from her mother's braid. The charm symbolized continuity, an unbroken chain between generations. New mothers received pendants shaped like water droplets to ensure their milk flowed freely, while travellers carried charms carved into the shape of serpents, protectors of the road, and symbols of rebirth. Not all charms were benign. Some were made to repel or curse. Women wronged in love or betrayed by rivals might request a black knot, a binding spell woven with soot and crow feathers. Though such acts were whispered about, they were never openly condemned. The Illyrians believed that even vengeance had its place in the balance of the world. Men feared the charm makers but respected them. Their huts stood slightly apart from the rest of the village, both sanctuary and warning. On stormy nights, villagers claimed to see faint lights flickering from within, signs that the women were speaking to the spirits. In Illyria, power did not always wear armour or wield a sword. Sometimes it was a woman sitting by the fire, murmuring to the wind, binding the fates of men with nothing but twine, bone, and whispered prayers. Every full moon, when the silver light spilled across the mountains like water, Illyrian women gathered to honour Bindus, their goddess of rivers, fertility, and rebirth. Though Bindus was often depicted as a male deity in later Roman writings, among Illyrian women she was feminine, fluid, and eternal. She was the pulse of the streams, the shimmer of the lakes, and the spirit that tied their bodies to the cycles of nature. These moonlit rites were the heart of Illyrian womanhood. At twilight, women of all ages walked silently towards sacred springs or secluded lakes, guided only by the glow of the moon and the hum of crickets. Their garments were white linen, embroidered with protective symbols, spirals for eternity, triangles for fertility, and eyes to ward off envy. At the water's edge, they formed a circle, each woman holding a small bowl carved from wood or horn, filled with milk and honey, Bindus's sacred offering. The ceremony began with the lighting of torches. The eldest priestess, known as the Water Mother, stepped into the shallows, her feet sinking into the cold mud, and raised her hands toward the moon. She invoked Bindus's blessing, her voice echoing through the still night air. One by one, the women poured their offerings into the water, whispering their desires. Healthy children, good harvests, safe journeys, forgiveness for past mistakes. The ripples carried their words to the goddess. Then came the dance. Barefoot and radiant in the moonlight, they moved in slow, spiralling circles, their arms lifting and lowering in rhythm with the chant. The dance mimicked the movement of water itself, gentle, flowing, and irresistible. As the tempo grew, Laughter began to ripple through the circle. Some women splashed into the water. Others raised their bowls to the moon, drinking the reflection as if tasting divinity. No man dared approach the site during these nights. The rites were said to shimmer with a power that could blind or curse any intruder. To the Illyrians, these moon gatherings weren't superstition. They were a pact. Each woman was a vessel of Bindus, and through her the goddess renewed the world. When dawn came, the women left quietly, their skin glistening with dew and moonlight. Behind them, the lake lay still, its surface touched by the divine breath of their devotion. Among the Illyrians, healing was a woman's domain, a sacred art passed from mother to daughter, guarded as fiercely as the tribe's ancestral fire. To heal was to honour the goddess Bindus, whose waters could both wound and mend. Every illness was seen not merely as a sickness of the body, but as a disturbance in the natural harmony between spirit, flesh, and earth. Illyrian women, known as Veshtis or wise healers, carried that balance in their hands. Their medicine was a fusion of ritual and remedy. They worked with herbs gathered at dawn, when the dew was said to trap the essence of life. Each plant had a spirit, a song, and a purpose. Yarrow for wounds, sage for purification, juniper for protection. The healer would murmur a blessing before cutting any leaf. As I take from the earth, may the earth take no harm. Even the act of boiling herbs into teas was performed in rhythm with whispered prayers, the steam itself considered a messenger to the gods. One of their most sacred healing customs was the water binding. When a woman fell ill from despair, exhaustion, or heartbreak, a common ailment in a world of endless wars, the healer led her to a spring. There, she washed her face with water drawn before sunrise, tied a red cord around her wrist, and placed 3 stones in her hand. Each stone represented what she wished to release: sorrow, fear, and weakness. As she cast them into the water, the healer sang, "Bindus, carry her pain away, and return her heart whole." Childbirth, too, was surrounded by protective magic. Pregnant women wore amulets shaped like fish, the symbol of life and flow. During labour, healers burned mugwort and rosemary to open the passage safely, while others sang low chants that mimicked the rhythm of waves, steady, endless, and calming. To the Illyrians, the sound of these chants was as powerful as any potion. Their knowledge baffled outsiders. Roman soldiers stationed in Illyria wrote of wild women who cured fevers with songs and poultices of crushed roots. Yet their methods worked. To the Illyrian women, healing was never simply science. It was a covenant with nature. Each cure reaffirmed that the goddess's breath still flowed through them, keeping their world alive, one prayer at a time. Marriage among the Illyrians was not a mere social contract. It was a sacred passage, guarded by symbols, songs, and secret rites known only to women. Before a bride could join her husband's household, she had to be reborn under the protection of the goddess Bindus and the ancestral spirits of her mother's line. The transformation from maiden to wife was marked by ritual, modest in appearance but rich in power. The preparation began days before the wedding. The bride bathed at dawn in a river or spring chosen by her mother. She was accompanied by elder women who carried torches and sang soft hymns invoking fertility and protection. As she emerged from the water, her attendants anointed her with goat's milk and wild honey, symbols of nourishment and sweetness in married life. Her hair was braided into a single long plait, interwoven with red thread to bind her spirit to that of her future husband. Yet, beneath the blessing, there was a whisper of warning, a reminder that marriage was both alliance and surrender. That evening, in the privacy of the women's hearth, the moon oath was performed. The bride knelt before a bowl of water reflecting the moonlight, while the village's oldest matron traced symbols on her palms with ash. "The moon watches the faithful," she murmured, "and reveals the deceitful." The oath bound the bride to honesty, but also shielded her from betrayal. Some believed the ritual could turn a deceitful husband's heart to stone, or render him barren if he broke his vows. During the wedding feast itself, the bride wore a veil embroidered with protective signs, triangles for fertility, spirals for eternal return. Guests tossed grains and dried herbs, not as tokens of joy, but as offerings to the spirits who guarded her womb and home. Once the feast ended, the newlyweds were led to their chamber, where the mother-in-law presented a loaf of bread shaped like a crescent moon. The bride broke it in two, a gesture symbolizing that love and sustenance would now be shared. To outsiders, these customs might have seemed superstitious, but to the Illyrians, they were divine choreography, rituals that stitched human love into the cosmic rhythm of life, death, and renewal. For every bride, the ceremony was not just a union of flesh, but of fate. In Illyrian belief, blood was not a symbol of violence. It was the essence of life itself, a bridge between mortals and gods. Women, whose bodies carried the mystery of birth and renewal, were seen as the natural guardians of this sacred substance. Their customs around blood, whether from birth, injury, or the monthly cycle, were woven with both fear and reverence. These rites were not hidden out of shame, but protected, for to mishandle blood was to disturb the balance between the seen and unseen worlds. During menstruation, Illyrian women withdrew from daily labour and lived apart in small huts known as houses of stillness. These shelters, built on the edge of villages near rivers or springs, were not prisons, but sanctuaries. There, women gathered to rest, heal, and share stories. They believed the goddess Bindus flowed through them during this time, cleansing the tribe through their own bodies. The water nearby symbolized purification, and the women would bathe under moonlight to honor the renewal of the cycle. Afterward, they burned sage and pine resin to send the goddess their thanks through fragrant smoke. Blood also played a role in protection rituals. Mothers mixed a drop of their own blood with clay to create markings on a newborn's forehead, symbols of vitality and divine blessing. Hunters departing for battle or long journeys would carry small pouches of fabric containing threads soaked in a woman's blood, believing it to be a charm of life force that guarded them from death. Though men rarely spoke of it, many warriors attributed their survival to these unseen feminine blessings. In times of plague or famine, Illyrian priestesses performed what was known as the Circle of Red Dawn. At sunrise, they traced blood circles on the ground, using a mixture of animal blood and sacred herbs, chanting for the goddess to turn her face from wrath to mercy. Within these circles, they buried offerings of grain, honey, and wine to appease the spirits of disease. To outsiders, especially later Roman chroniclers, such customs seemed barbaric. Yet to the Illyrians, blood was not a taboo, but a prayer made visible. It was the rhythm of existence itself, proof that the goddess walked among them, pulsing within every woman's veins. In their hands, blood became both shield and blessing, a covenant written in life's purest ink. Death among the Illyrians was never an end. It was a transformation. And at the heart of that transformation stood the women. They were the mourners, the guardians of the departed, and the keepers of the final rites that ensured the soul's safe passage to the afterworld. The Illyrians believed that the dead lingered for 3 nights after death, trapped between the world of flesh and the shadowy realm beneath the earth. During those nights, it was the duty of women to guide them home. When a person died, the oldest women of the household, usually mothers or grandmothers, covered every mirror in the house and extinguished all flames except one, the sacred lamp of Bindus. This single light burned beside the body to guide the spirit through darkness. They then washed the body with spring water mixed with ash and rosemary, murmuring words of farewell that were half prayer, half spell. The cleansing was both physical and spiritual. It freed the soul from the weight of the living world. That night, the morning song began. Women gathered around the body, their hair unbound, their voices rising in long, haunting laments. The rhythm echoed the pulse of the earth itself, slow and deep. They recited the deeds of the departed, their joys, their mistakes, and their lineage. Each name spoken aloud kept the spirit tethered until it was ready to depart. Tears were not weakness. They were offerings, proof that the living still remembered. At dawn on the third day, the women led a procession to the burial ground. They carried the body wrapped in linen, adorned with personal charms, rings, beads, or carved wooden idols meant to protect the soul. A loaf of bread, a jug of water, and a coin were buried beside them, food for the journey, drink for the road, and payment to cross into the next realm. When the burial was complete, the women burned their veils and bathed once more in cold river water, symbolizing purification from death's touch. As the smoke drifted skyward, they whispered, "Go with the river, not against it." To the Illyrians, death was not feared, it was navigated. And through the voice, tears, and hands of women, every soul was safely delivered back to the eternal flow of Bindus. Long after the Illyrian tribes faded into history, swallowed by Rome, reshaped by new gods and empires, the echoes of their women endured. Their rituals, once whispered beside sacred springs and mountain fires, did not vanish. They changed form, hiding themselves in the folds of peasant customs, folk songs, and secret prayers whispered by grandmothers to daughters. The Illyrian woman's world of fertility, moonlight, and divine water survived in the rhythm of daily life long after her temples turned to dust. Archaeologists still uncover fragments of this hidden heritage. In remote Balkan hills, burial sites reveal bronze charms shaped like crescents and fish, symbols of the goddess Bindus. Pottery etched with spirals and wave patterns speaks of the eternal flow between life, death, and rebirth. Even centuries later, villagers along the Adriatic coast continued to pour milk into rivers for the mother beneath the water, unaware that they were honouring a goddess whose name had been forgotten but whose spirit endured. The Illyrian women's songs also lived on, woven into the region's folk laments and wedding hymns. Their melodies, low, haunting and cyclical, still echo through the mountains of Albania, Montenegro and Bosnia. The verses that once called to Bindus now speak to the Virgin Mary or unnamed white ladies of the springs, yet the rhythm remains unchanged. Water, moon, birth, renewal. The sacred language simply found new names to wear. Even modern customs retain traces of their rites. The red threads tied around newborn wrists, the washing of brides in river water, the mourning songs sung by women at funerals. All are ancient gestures, fragments of Illyria woven seamlessly into modern identity. Each act carries the faint memory of the goddess, the charm maker, and the healer. What made Illyrian women remarkable was not their secrecy, but their endurance. They mastered survival through adaptation, turning myth into daily practice, ritual into rhythm. In their hands, spirituality was not confined to temples or priests. It was carried in baskets, sung over bread, and whispered to rivers. Though their names are lost to history, their presence remains carved into the land itself. Every stream, every moonlit clearing, and every protective charm is a quiet reminder. The daughters of Bindus may be gone, but their spirit still moves like water, unbroken, eternal, and endlessly reborn.